putting it in the
Alright, we're up.
Hello and welcome to another installment of the book club. We're doing chapters. We're doing chapters 20 to 22 today, so that way we have something to do next week instead of just covering chapter 24. We can also cover chapter 23. Also, chapter 22 is fairly long, and that's a good thing because we are finally talking about inflation today after it has been deferred, so long. All the way back, I believe, in the first episode, we actually started deferring talk about inflation, and we've been doing that pretty much every week since. So now we finally get to talk about that. We also get to talk about profits and price signaling. We also get to talk about purchasing power again. So this is Colton, as usual. I'm here with Emo and Kyle. Kyle just stepped out, so he'll be right back. Do you want to say something, Emo?
Just want to make sure that, I probably should have asked this first, but I have that extra chapter in between 19 and I guess 21 that was, hold on 1 second. Do unions really, raise wages, or was that another chapter?
No,
I got the one with the extra chapter in it.
Yeah,
So I just want to make sure I did enough to buy back the product is the right one I was supposed to do.
Yeah, I think we did do unions really raise wages last week, and so I think the reason why your 19 and 20 are mixed up is because you have rent control.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, I have rent control in here.
Yeah, and so we chose not to do that because I don't have that edition of the book. I have the original 1946 edition.
Okay.
And we did talk about rent control last week, but it's, I don't know. There's been, if you really want to learn about rent control, there's a good Mises U lecture on it by Walter Block.
All right.
So yeah, I'm just basically trying to kill time until we get a watch or two in here. So, as usual, we want suggestion of books with the theme being Austrian economics and libertarianism. Other schools of libertarianism can be covered in the future, but we will do that after getting the main books of the Austrian school done. After this book, we're going to be going to the Anti-Capitalist Mentality by Mises. It's a good introduction to Mises, and it's also a very short book, so it won't take us too long. It might take us 3 weeks, but I'm actually thinking more like 2. Depending on.
Just do it in 2.
Yeah. If we don't get other suggestions, we'll probably go on to something like choice or where's that list of books? But we already have a list of things we want to do in the future, not necessarily in an order. So.
All right. I'm excited to get to another book too. I'm as enlightened as I've been reading through this. I'm ready to move on to other things.
Yeah, another book we might want to do fairly soon in the future is a theory of socialism and capitalism.
Oh yeah, that one's going to be fun to talk about. Yep. It was a fun listen. It was a fun listen to the audiobook. I really enjoyed just hearing his perspective on, even conservative socialists, because it's not something most, especially conservatives themselves, just seem to refuse to acknowledge that somebody can be technically a conservative and a socialist at the same time.
Right, and I actually haven't been able to get through that entire chapter because I get lost along the way. But from what I remember, he's mostly talking about the feudalists and the monarch and how that can lead to socialism.
Yep. That's part of it, for sure. Which is kind of, I feel like it's a little bit ironic for Hoppe, even though he doesn't he doesn't really advocate for monarchy. It's still considering, it's still kind of funny considering, you know, a lot of us tend to go in that direction.
Yeah, well, if you're going to be a Hoppean minarchist, you're going to be a feudalist or a monarchist. It's just what you're going to,
It's for
what
the
the
aesthetics.
arguments. Yeah.
It's
what the
purely
argument-
for the aesthetics.
Yeah, but
we got any watchers yet?
are you watching on this or no?
I just turned my PS4 on to go to the YouTube.
Okay, so
So, I
apparently
haven't
we
made it
have
there yet.
someone watching. I'm not sure if that's Kyle or not, but we can get started. I just wanted to give people some time to come in, so that way we aren't like finishing one of the 3 chapters we're doing. By the time.
All right. You want me to go ahead and start, or you want me to wait another moment?
Go ahead and start. I'm going to be tweeting again to try to get people in.
Okay. So, Chapter 21, enough to buy back the product. Amateur economists are always asking for just wages and just prices, not necessarily just economists, but people writing on the economy. Classical economists came up with the idea of functional prices and wages. Functional prices are those that encourage the most amount of production and the largest volume of sales. Functional wages are those that bring about the largest amount of employment and the largest real payrolls. However, Marxists and their unconscious followers, known as the purchasing power school, have perverted the term functional wages to mean that the only wages that will work, an example, wages that will prevent an economic crash, are those that will allow the worker to buy back the product they make. Marxist and the purchasing power schools attribute every depression of the past to the preceding failure to pay such wages. Despite this, they never say wages are high enough to buy back the product. Union leaders have found this argument effective when they haven't been able to convince the public nor the employer, who they find as evil by definition, to pay fair wages otherwise. They have found an argument that appeals to the public's selfish motives in order to force the employer to grant their demands. But how are we to know when labor has enough to buy back the product, or more than enough? How is it determined? The Marxists and purchasing power school haven't made the effort to answer this.
And that's actually a good point that Hazlitt brings up is without leaving it to the market, how do we know that how do we know that someone is being paid what they should be paid? Like, how would an exogenous price for labor come about?
Right, and I don't understand why, because you are making something, you need to be earning back the amount it would cost. I mean, the amount it would cost to buy back the product anyway. Like, you have other, like, say, if you're making a car or whatever, like, don't you have food and other more, like, immediate needs that you need to be buying, rather, like,
Well,
especially if you already have a car, why would you need to make the same amount in the first place?
And it's not like these people have gone into business for themselves and made a call all by themselves using their capital and their labor alone. They're being employed by someone to help make cars, because no single person on the assembly line is making the call all by themselves. That's the whole point of an assembly line, actually.
Right. It's part of the division of labor. Like, you're just doing your part, and you agree. And not even that. Well, besides that, you agreed to a particular wage when you got the job.
Yeah. Although we saw in last week that all of the terrible arguments that come from saying that, oh, the worker doesn't have enough what would they say, they what would they call it, the worker doesn't have enough something, and so they need to collectively bargain together.
It's not purchasing power, is it?
No, it's not purchasing power. It's basically power in a negotiation.
There's a phrase for that, isn't there?
Yeah.
I'm flipping through real quick because I can't remember what it was.
Yeah.
I can't find it quick enough.
Yep.
So, did you have anything else?
See. So let me get back to what I was just talking about. Also, it is fairly interesting that he goes into the public selfish motives in order to force the employer to grant their demands.
Mm-hmm.
That, this is something that really isn't talked about in the mainstream. It's always the greedy capitalist and the workers just trying to get by.
Yeah, because
good.
Because people don't understand economics, they just think, oh, because they've got more money, that it's not going to lead to an increase in prices, or anything like that. They're just thinking, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they want. They just know that they want to be able to buy more of what they need or of what they want as well.
Yep.
Which is why economics is such an important thing that needs to be taught, so people will stop falling for stuff like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's actually interesting that he even does he call out the Marxists, or does he not?
He does.
Okay. It's interesting that he would talk about Marxists and then fairly soon after that talk about union leaders, because it is the socialists that are the unionists.
Yeah, it tends to be union leaders that are socialists.
Yep. Well, I mean, that's who brought about the union movement, the unionization movement to America.
Mm.
So
was there any particular I don't know, leader or anything that did that?
no,
Just out of curiosity.
It was mostly the Germans coming over that did that, but they were German anarchists. They were the anarcho-communists or anarcho-syndicalists.
I'm not sure what the difference between communism and syndicalism is. I know the academic agent had done a video on it, but even he said he didn't even really understand like what they're even saying.
The syndicalists believe basically in worker cooperatives.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically a way of replacing management with workers. So workers are the management.
So it's that whole like rotating position type thing.
Yeah.
Where like for like I don't know, 1 week you're all the managers, and then the next week they're all the workers, and something like that.
That's one way of implementing it. Another way of implementing it is to have a managerial class that is part of the working class. To represent, and they'd be democratically elected.
Mm-hmm.
However, this is very similar to how the anarcho-communists would have it, where they'd have democratically elected leaders on a council telling each business, how much to make and what to make, and so on and so forth. So there's probably some autistic difference between the two, but the difference isn't large enough to really even say that they're different systems. They're just like slightly different manifestations of the same thing.
Okay, I've been told that like for the flag with the red and black anarcho communist flag, like the positioning of whether the red is on top or on the bottom is the difference. But yeah, that really does seem pretty much like an autistic distinction.
Yep.
So I guess let's move on to the next couple of points. He gives some examples of how much automobile union members were making and such, despite still making demands. So most automobile union members in the 1940s were in the upper third of the country's income receivers, and their weekly wages were 20% higher than the average wages for factory workers and twice as great as workers in retail trade. Despite this, they were still demanding 30% pay increases so they could bolster their fast shrinking ability to absorb the goods they made. But what about the retail worker and the factory worker? If auto union members needed 30% pay increases to keep the economy from crashing, would retail and factory workers need the same, or 50%, 55% higher to give them as much purchasing power as the auto workers? It that it it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like, why should, like, because the retail workers and the other factory workers, like, they still need to buy they still need to buy like cars and stuff too. So like it doesn't really make sense. Like, why should the automobile union members make so much that they just buy what they make, so that there's like a whole lot less left for other people to purchase? That just decreases profits and production.
Well, and to think about it another way, why, even within the automobile factory, why would a Ford manufacturing employee make more or less or the same amount as a Chrysler? Like, why would that be the same? You know, or why would the Chrysler employee get paid more just because the car is more expensive with that he's building? It's
I
just it's sorry, I should restart. Why should the Chrysler manufacturing employee make more than the Ford manufacturing employee when they're essentially doing the same job, but Chrysler sell for more?
I mean,
In
if
order to buy
Chrysler's
back,
out competing, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, Chrysler, in order to buy back a Chrysler, the Chrysler employee would have to be paid more than the Ford. But why would that be the distinction? Why wouldn't it be the work that they do? The value
It
added, essentially.
it just doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah.
I don't like the argument just doesn't make any sense in the first place. So it's just like I can't even answer the question.
Yeah, it's just odd. Now, there is a market mechanism to basically do this. So the marginal revenue product of labor is the marginal revenue that the last worker adds to the entire process. So for instance, if I was to hire another manufacturing employee and he would make me an additional $15 an hour of work that he does, then I would be inclined to pay him a wage up to $15 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think we talked about this last week, but let's say someone else is offering him at a job at $14.50 an hour. Well, that doesn't benefit me as the employer, to have some other company pay him. So I might offer him $14.55, and so on and so forth. And it is through this process that workers get bid up to the marginal revenue product of labor, or essentially, they get bid up to what they add to the entire process.
Okay.
Because you can think that, once I offer him $14.55, he might go back to the other employer or a third employer and tell them he has a job offer for this, and so they might offer him $14.60, and so on and so forth.
Okay, because you're selling your labor on the market as well, and you can pretty much bargain for that. It's a lot harder to do that now with all the, laws put in place for like minimum wage and all that.
Well, that might be true for a minimum wage laborer, but as someone who makes more than twice minimum wage, if you have multiple offers, you can go to the other person and say, hey, can you match or come close to matching this other offer? Because I'd rather work for your company than someone else's.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll go to them because they're offering me like $10,000 more a year. So they might come back and say, okay, we'll match that, or we'll come close to matching that. And so there's not only money that you have to consider when you're talking about going to companies, but there's also work policies and other benefits, essentially.
Right. It doesn't really seem, and taking into account that there's union dues as well, it doesn't really seem like being a part of a union's really going to help out in the long run anyway.
Well, the thing is that unions make deals with someone and make deals with companies. So pretty much everyone at that factory makes that whatever band of money, essentially. And it's based on seniority, not necessarily on production. And so, for instance, Toyota got a better deal from the Auto Workers Union than Ford or GM did, and that's why Toyota cars are so much more reliable, because for the same price, they're able to put in better machined parts, essentially.
Okay.
And so, meanwhile, Ford and GM need to skimp on the other costs because of their labor costs are so high comparatively to Toyota.
Right.
And so the unionization of labor actually reduces the ability for labor to market itself, because in many cases you have to be part of the union and in order to get the job. And so the deal is already made for you. You can't sell yourself. You're already with you're not one of the parties that is on the buying and selling. You're just part of one organization that is doing so.
Right. So unions can basically like collectivize what you're worth.
Yeah, it's called collective bargaining.
Okay. I heard about that a while back before I was into Austrian economics and thought it sounded like a good idea, but I've pretty much figured it's not.
Yeah, it's just yeah, it kind of sounds good on the surface because it's like, but once you start learning how the market works, it's it's precise. It works against how the market works, and so actually, and we're going to be talking about unions in the final chapter of today, so we should probably come back to this discussion at some point.
Okay. I guess I'll move on to the next point. Let's see. Back then as well as now, enormous differences exist in wages between different industries. In 1976, retail traders averaged about $113 weekly, and workers in manufacturing earned about $207, and contracted construction was about $284. So, I mean, you're pretty much seeing like if you're gonna increase wages by 30% for one industry, then you're really like hurting a lot of other people.
Yeah,
they're not going to have a price increase. Only those members of those unions will be able to buy, those products much quicker, leaving less for everybody else to buy, meaning there'll be less profit made.
Right, and let's say we were to increase everything by 30%, it doesn't make sense that that they should all be in proportion to each other into the future as well, because the value of each worker, each industry can change over time.
Right. And you can see that pretty much every day. Just like walk into a Walmart and like every couple of days the prices could be shifted dramatically. Maybe not dramatically, but they're always like going up and down by some amount.
Yep, and so that's one key point of Austrian economics is that there's not the demand and supply don't just work as you would typically see it in a micro or macroeconomics course, with the demand slope and the supply slope, but they shift over time. And so,
right.
Yeah, so some comparisons like that are made in mainstream economics that would, like, for instance, there was the demand and supply curve of microchips, but they tracked it from the 1970s into the early aughts. And so this, it's almost 40 years of trying to create this demand and supply curve, and it's just like, no, you can't just take 40 years of data and apply it as if nothing has changed. Temporal changes happen.
Right. And because value is subjective, what people want and need are constantly changing. And there's so many varieties of just events happening that cause changes in what people are currently valuing more than something else. That's just the nature of the market. That's just the nature of people.
Yep. Anyways, I think we should continue.
Okay. The argument that labor should have enough to buy back their product is a general version of the purchasing power argument. It's true enough that wages are purchasing power, but so are the wages of every worker, employer, landlord, etc. In an exchange economy, everyone's wages is someone else's costs. Every increase in wages is an increase in cost of production, and an increase in production costs where price increases forbidden takes the profit away from producers, cuts production, and causes unemployment. Even if a price increase is possible, it will cause a loss in buyers and shrink the market. A loss in profit production, excuse me, it will cause a loss in buyers and shrink the market, and cause a loss in profit production and cause more employment.
You mean
If a
cause
30%,
more unemployment?
I think that might have been a typo, but
It'll cause more unemployment, not cause more employment.
oh, sorry. Were you gonna say something?
No, No, go ahead and make your point, then I'll talk about it.
Okay. If a 30% wage increase all around causes a 30% price increase, labor can't buy back any more than what it could at the beginning.
Yeah, and that's, as we've talked about earlier, it's not necessarily true that a 30% wage increase causes a 30% price increase, although it can.
Right.
You know, it's kind of difficult to see what a 30% wage increase will do to price, the final price of the product. So let's continue.
Yeah. There are those who would dispute an equal increase in prices. It's true that it can only happen in the long run, and only if monetary and credit policy permit it. If money and credit are so inelastic that they do not increase when wages are forced up, and the wages are not justified by existing productivity in dollar terms, then the main effect of wage increases will be to force unemployment. Total payrolls in dollar amount and in real purchasing power will decrease. A drop in employment brought about by union policy and not a transitional phase brought about by technological advancement will necessarily means that fewer goods are being produced for everyone, and it is unlikely that labor will compensate for the losses by getting a greater share of the production that's left.
Yep. Yeah, this is a big reason why I dislike unions, is just because it causes unemployment. Like it, you know.
Yeah, like
Not only
people that will try to, like, people that maybe need some amount of money can't underbid the unions.
Yep. And yeah, anyways, and it goes into all the unionization laws and such things. If employers were able to just hire out new workers, or to just ignore what the union is demanding and just tell the workers, hey, we're going to be offering the same thing, regardless, it would be, it would be fine. But it's mostly the union laws that cause the unions to have as much political power as they do.
Yeah. I guess moving on. If wages are pushed up above the marginal rate of productivity, the decrease in employment would normally be 3 to 4 times as great as the increase in hourly rates, so total incomes of the workers would be reduced correspondingly. If we assume that the previous relationship between wages and prices itself is a quote-unquote normal long-run relationship, then it is altogether probable that the increase... oh man, I messed up my notes. That's what I get for doing them with the voice chat. That the increase of 30% in wages will ultimately lead to an increase of prices approximately the same percentage.
Right. And it's actually interesting that he talks about the marginal rate of productivity, because that's the marginal revenue product of labor. That's what it's called now. It's what it's called, essentially. It's interesting that he uses a different terminology, but what it's mainly referred to now is the marginal revenue product.
Okay.
Because what is productivity other than revenue, really?
Right. I guess moving on, the belief that the price increase would be substantially less than that rests on two main fallacies. The first is that only looking at the direct labor costs of a particular firm or industry and assuming these to represent all the labor costs involved. But this is an elementary error of mistaking a part for the whole. Each industry represents not only just one section of the productive process considered horizontally, but just one section of that process considered vertically as well. Thus, the direct labor costs of making automobiles in the automobile factories themselves may be less than third of the total costs, and this may lead to the incautious to conclude that a 30% increase in wages would lead to only about a 10% increase or less in automobile prices. This would be to overlook the indirect wage costs in raw materials and purchase parts and transportation charges in new factories or new machines towards prices or the dealer markup.
Yeah. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier, that it's hard to figure out what the price increase would be when you increase wages. I remember reading about it, but I didn't know if we were at that point or not, so.
Right. It's pretty much like so if the unions are basically forcing the employer to pay them more, that's less money going towards all these other factors in the productive process that are needed for that are needed for the production itself.
Yep.
And he goes on to say, government estimates show that in the 15-year period from 1929 to 1943, wages and salaries in the United States averaged 69% of national income. In the 5-year period from 1956 to 1960, they also averaged 69% of the national income. In the 5 years between 1970 and 1976, I think he meant 6 years. It said 5 in my book, but whatever. Wages and their salaries average 66% of the national income, and when supplements are added, total compensation of employees averaged 76% of the national income. These wages and salaries, of course, had to be paid out of the national product, while there would have to be both deductions from these figures and additions to them to provide a fair estimate of labor's income, so that we may assume on this basis that labor costs cannot be less than about 2/3 of total production costs, and may run above 3/4 depending upon our definition of labor.
Yep, go ahead.
Hang on 1 second. If you have anything to say, take over for a second.
Okay. Second, where are we? National income. Yeah, and so it's just more getting into government statistics about what a increase in wages would be if what the increases in prices would be if wages are increased. It's hard to track all of this down, even once you have the relevant theory behind you.
Okay, well, I'm back now.
Yep, I saw what you did.
I'm sorry. It's the fastest way to do it, but it messes up sometimes.
Yeah, the as far as yeah. And the thing is that when you were reading that, I was hoping that you would have something to say because I was going over the notes for the profits at that time.
That's fine. If you want to finish what you were saying.
I was finished. I was just trying to summarize what you had said.
Oh, okay. Well, let me continue. It does not necessarily follow that wage earners would make no relative gains. They would make relative gains, and other elements in the population would suffer a relative loss during the period of transition. But it is improbable that this relative gain would mean an absolute gain. This kind of change in the relationship of costs to prices contemplated here could hardly take place without bringing about unemployment and unbalanced, interrupted, or reduced production. So that while labor might get a wider slice of a smaller pie during this period of transition and adjustment to a new equilibrium, it may be doubted whether this would be greater in absolute size than the previous narrow slice of a larger pie. Equilibrium wages and prices are the wages and prices that equalize supply and demand. If either through government or private coercion, an attempt is made to lift prices above their equilibrium level, demand is reduced and therefore production is reduced. If an attempt is made to push prices below their equilibrium level, the consequent reduction or wiping out of profits will mean the falling off of superior new production. Therefore, any attempt to force prices either above or below their equilibrium levels will act to reduce the volume of employment and production below what would otherwise have been. As the prices, wages, and profits that should determine the distribution of a product that best prices are in the high blah blah blah.
Yeah. Also, Jim Jesus says I've read 4 or 5 Hopper cooks. I mean bits. I mean not enough to critique him, but here I am. Yes, we did see that SO stream. I at least caught the beginning of it, and then I just dipped out because the people I was talking to at the time lost interest in it as well. I was not that interested in hearing what a bunch of leftists had to say.
Yeah, I caught about 10-15 minutes of it, and it was just like
yep.
That's all I kept hearing, and I was just like,
what? And I watched the entirety of the Jim Jesus stream yesterday, and it was so much of people who aren't even libertarians, all Hoppeans. Like, that was their example of Hoppeans that they wanted to go over. The only Hoppean I do know that they went after was Atomic, who's a teenager. You know, he's not exactly like Stefan Kinsella or someone, that you would think that if you wanted to go after Hoppeans, you'd go after the intellectual heavyweights and not just some kid.
Right. Also, don't forget, we're more dangerous and subversive than Marxists.
I kind of wish that was true because the Marxists have the Chaz and we have nothing. You know, if we had our own Hoppean Covenant community somewhere in rural Texas or Oklahoma, that would be based in Redfield.
How unfortunate that Tom Wood's League of the South never accomplished a whole lot.
Yeah, and it's actually sad that the League of the South went towards neo-Confederacy instead of bringing up the Southern tradition of, let's say Thomas Jefferson and so forth.
Yeah, that's kind of disappointing.
Yeah, Jim Jesus says Hop Blue. He also went off to Hop Blue in obvious ways that anyone familiar could know he's going after Hop Blue, but he hid his icon and his name, so no one would no one would know.
Oh man, is Hop Blue Voldemort now?
Yeah,
he who shall not be named.
Yeah, I don't know if you're seeing all these Jim Jesus messages, but
I'm not.
Hoppe is a Marxist, Hoppe is a consequentialist, Hoppe is a third positionist, Hoppe is a monarchist. The monarchist thing has the most weight behind it, because if you were a Hoppean and a minarchist, and you would obviously be a monarchist or at least a feudalist.
Right. Even though Hoppe's like explicitly been like it's on the back of Democracy the God That Failed. Like he's not advocating for monarchy. He's simply saying that it was more free.
Right. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. If you're a minarchist that believes that there has to be a state, but you want it to be the minimal state, but you also listen to Hoppe, you would be a monarchist. But it's Hoppe actually. What did Hoppe say about that? Oh yeah, everyone from Stalin to Hitler was a minarchist.
Yeah.
Everyone wants the state to do the minimal amount possible. It's not just
what's the minimal amount?
Yeah, that's always the question. That's always what the debate is about. It's never about should the state do the maximum amount possible?
Right. It never ends.
Yep.
It's hard to imagine if you consider Soviet Russia to be minarchist, that what could the maximum state in the Soviet Union be?
Yeah, no.
Everybody, they just drop nukes on themselves at that point.
What is it? That's the Posadists. They want to.
They want to like nuke. They want to nuke the world or something to bring about a communist revolution or something like that. Don't take my word on that.
Yeah,
but it's something like that.
Yeah, it's something like that. They want to basically bring about a communist utopia by nuking everything. I guess we'd all be equally dead.
Hey, equality at any cost.
But unless there's some other comment that wants to be made, I think we should continue. We're about to finish up chapter 21. Chapter 22 is fairly short. And then we get to talk about inflation. So.
Yeah, and I didn't really get to make notes for that one because I suck. But because it's literally like 3 pages, it's pretty easy to go through. So I'll probably just like skim through and just like read stuff that stuck out, that I remember sticking out to me.
Yeah.
Because the function of profits is fairly simple.
Yeah, I can do that. I've already skimmed through it. That's what I was doing.
Okay. Okay.
So.
Let me look at my last little paragraph that I got. As to the prices, wages, and profits that should determine the distribution of a product, that best prices are in up to the highest prices. God, what did I type? Oh my god. Okay. I'll just read the paragraph itself since I quoted it verbatim. As to the prices, wages, and profits that should determine the distribution of that product, the best prices are not the highest prices, but the prices that encourage the largest volume of production and the largest volume of sales. The best wage rates for labor are not the highest wage rates, but the wage rates that permit full production, full employment, and the largest sustained payrolls. The best profits from the standpoint not only of industry but of labor are not the lowest profits, but the profits that encourage most people to become employers or to provide more employment than before. If we try to run the economy for the benefit of a single group or class, we shall injure or destroy all groups, including the members of the very class for whose benefit we have been trying to run it. We must run the economy for everybody.
Right, and this reminds me of a lecture that Walter Block was one time making of he would give intro to economics students a demand curve, and say he wouldn't give them a demand curve. He would give them a range of production that they can sell at, and he would ask what should they sell at, and the answer was that they don't have enough information. They need prices to go along with the production, as prices will fall as you are able to sell more. And so it's not necessarily how much you produce that you want to maximize, or what is the highest price that you can sell for. It's the amount of revenue. You want to increase that.
Right. So
that's
moving on to 22
chapter 22.
now?
At least in my book, it's chapter 22. If you have a later edition, there's going to be added chapters. I have the original 1946 edition.
XXII is 22. Correct?
Yes.
I should know that. That one that rent control chapter shifted the book in a really weird way.
Because it just increased everything by 1.
Yeah.
So if you have the 1970 something edition, it's going to be chapter 22 for you. But for me, it's chapter 21. Sorry about that. I was
okay. It's not your fault. It's just a thing that happens with books.
Yeah.
So you want to go ahead and take?
Yeah, I'll take over. To increase our understanding, we shall go over again some of the ground already covered in chapter 14, which was the price system, but we shall view the subject from a different angle. Profits are not the largest form of income in our economy. It's actually about less than 5% of the national income. Yet profits are the form of income towards which there is the most hostility. It is significant that there is the word profiteer, but there is not a wagier or a lossier. Yet profits of the owner of a barbershop may average less not merely than the salary of a motion picture star or the hired head of a steel corporation, but less even than the average wage of skilled labor. The subject is clouded by factual misconceptions. The total profits of General Motors, which is the largest industrial corporation in the world, are taken as if they were typical and not exceptional. So it may be true that a particular company does have a lot of revenue or profits, but that does not mean that all businesses have exceptional profits. As we were going over weeks ago, the profit margin of a particular company is typically fairly low. Like at Walmart, I believe it's less than 2%. So it's, even if a large company has large amounts of has large amounts of profits, it actually pays a ton in material costs, capital costs, and labor costs. And a lot of these costs actually are labor costs, because let's say you're talking about capital costs. Some of the capital cost is the cost to build a Walmart, which is goes into construction crews, and then also it goes into concrete, and someone has to make the concrete, and so that's also labor costs, and so on and so forth. There's in terms of income, labor is what most of the national income is.
Right, and you really see like a major theme in this book, and I guess in Austrian economics in general, is you see how interconnected pretty much every activity really is across vast swaths of industry. And then not even just those industries, like every position that every position of employment in those industries, and how they're all interconnected and dependent upon one another.
Right. Yeah, and
I was also going to say...
yeah, one of the interesting things is that one of the proposals that we talk about is to limit profits to, say, 10% of some figure. But think about it like this: if you're going into business and you can only keep 10% of revenue, but you can lose your entire capital, that's going to be a disincentive to open up businesses, and it's also a disincentive to continue on, in case of loss.
Right, and isn't it true that a majority of businesses attempted to have been started, I worded that kind of weird, fail within their first or second year?
Yep, it's this is the trial and error of the entrepreneurial system that anyone who talks about praxeology talks about, because there are many things that you cannot know through praxeological methods and are left up to the entrepreneur.
Right.
And this is actually a big point at the end of praxeological lectures, is that Austrians are very dogmatic about a very limited scope of things, like the law of demand and so on and so forth. But when it comes to a great many things, they are less dogmatic and less and more humble than mainstream or economists, I should say, because they leave up to entrepreneurs to figure out if people like Burger King more than burger democracy.
Right. I forgot who made that Burger King Burger Democracy example. I found that one really funny.
I came up with the burger democracy one, but I just took an example from Hoppean, and instead of McDonald's, I said burger democracy. Emo, are you there?
I think he lost connection or something.
That sucks. So let me continue.
Him in the voice chat, but I can't hear him or anything.
Yeah, same. People watching, tell me if you guys can hear Emo or not.
No, if I can hear him, people are not going to be able to hear him. Also, he left now. He's probably going to rejoin. I think he just lost connection.
Yeah, that's probably what happened. Hey, Emo.
There he is.
I have returned like the Phoenix.
Welcome back. What happened?
Okay.
Thanks.
So it was me that just changed a saying from Hoppe into Bogo King into Bogo Democracy, because I know of Hoppe's arguments against democracy and monarchy.
Okay. I can't remember if it was Hopper or somebody else.
Didn't
It wasn't important. I was just being autistic about remembering where that came from.
didn't Liberty Hangout make a meme with that as well?
Yeah.
Possibly. It's not that original, is what I'll say.
Yeah.
But you know. Yeah, and this is kind of interesting as people advocating for government policies and even government policies themselves, the proponents of government policies that are in existence, tend to assume that production will go on automatically no matter what is done to discourage it. This can be seen in price fixing policies, but in this profit control policy, it would also be true. People might regard some profits as excessive or unreasonable, but it's basically they're judging this as if there's some exogenous method of formulating what profits should be.
What does that word mean, by the way?
Exogenous, coming from without. So what I mean by an exogenous profit, or what the exogenous what I mean by this is as if there's some profit rate that comes from without the market, which means from some praxeological theory or so on and so forth, that tells you what the profit rate should be outside of market transactions.
Okay. Yeah,
So,
I don't see who gets to determine what would be an obscene profit. Like, if people are giving, money to somebody, that's their choice. They deserve every cent that they get, because it was given to them voluntarily.
Yep. And so one function of profits is to guide and channel the factors of production so as to apportion the relative output of thousands of different commodities in accordance with demand. No bureaucrat, no matter how brilliant, can solve this problem arbitrarily. Free profits and free prices will maximize production and relieve shortages quicker than any other system. Whereas arbitrarily fixed prices and arbitrarily limited profits can only prolong shortages and reduce production and employment. And this is what I mean by exogenous prices and profit rates, because they will be arbitrary because there is no way to predetermine what they should be.
Right. That's only for the consumer to decide.
Yep. So not only is prices a signal, but so are profits to tell businesses. So prices and costs of production are related to the entrepreneur in terms of profits and losses. So if his profits start to decline, that's a signal that what he's doing is not as valuable as it used to be. Or if they start to increase, it means that it's more valuable. And so
Right.
This will tell investors where to spend their money in order to invest.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that pretty much makes clear sense to me. If there wasn't a demand for these products, then they wouldn't be spending their money on it. And if people are spending their money on it in large quantities, then that's telling the producer to invest more in the resources and the labor and investing in labor saving devices to increase production of that.
Yep, and it not only tells the producer which goods are the most economical to make, but which are the most economical ways to make them.
Mm-hmm.
And this question of how much and of what to produce is not only needed to be answered by a capitalist one, as we just described, but it also needs to be answered by a socialist system.
Right,
So,
and this goes into like the economic calculation problem.
Yep. And so it's interesting that Hazlitt actually talks about this. He doesn't really, talk about the economic calculation problem, but he does bring up that a socialist system would need to be able to do this. And he even talks about a bureaucrat, which is basically what, the party is in a communist system.
Right.
It's the replacement of entrepreneurs with bureaucrats. So, moving on to chapter 22, if you have a later edition of the book, it's chapter 23. So, previously we have deferred the analysis of inflation. We will finally talk about it in this episode, and in this chapter. So, the most obvious and stubborn of errors is to confuse money and wealth. Adam Smith wrote, "Wealth consists in money or in gold and silver is the notion that wealth consists in money or in gold and silver is a popular notion which naturally arises from the double function of money as the instrument of commerce and as the measure of value. To grow rich is to get money and wealth, in short, are in common language considered in every respect synonymous. Real wealth consists of what is produced and consumed, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the products we produce, etc. Those that openly make this mistake are the most naive of inflationists. The second group, which is less naive, see that all problems could be solved if government could just print more money to solve the issues. They see an issue with this thinking, that all problems could be solved if government could just print money to solve the issues. Instead, they want to print just enough to cover some deficiency or gap. They argued back in Hazlitt's day that purchasing power was chronically deficient, that the market does not distribute enough money back to the producers to enable them to buy back the product being made. There is a leak somewhere. We already talked about this at the beginning of the stream. It's the first chapter. But such proponents might want to move this purchasing power through inflation, essentially, through subsidization of some group. Another group proves this through equations. They call this the gap between A and A plus B payments. The cruder apostles of social credit may seem ridiculous, but there are many schools which are only slightly more sophisticated that propose scientific plans to issue just enough money or to fill some gap or deficiency. And it's actually kind of interesting. I actually had to look up what social credit was, and it's something that's no longer in existence, but it was popular in the 1930s and 1940s in Britain specifically. And yeah, it's a school that lost out to the Keynesians, essentially.
What do you have any idea what they I guess believed in?
They so the A payments were the payments to wage owners and producers and salesmen, and the B payments were to various middlemen and to the banks and so on and so forth. The more Austrian school criticism is that their complaints are inflationary, but I didn't really have time to read any more complex analysis. I just kind of looked at a conclusion, essentially.
Okay. I was just curious.
So, the more knowing inflationists know that printing money will cause an increase in commodity prices. It is precisely what they want. It is to help some groups, such as debtors or exporters, at the cost of either the people giving out the debts or importers.
All right. We talked about that a couple chapters ago as well.
Yeah, but this is putting things in a new light of inflation. Not just tariffs, but you might want to have subsidies paid for by inflation. There are many theories that say increased quantities of money will not affect prices if done correctly. They don't see that twice as much goods cannot be consumed unless twice as many are produced. They think that the only thing that holds down an indefinite increase in production is a mere shortage of monetary demand. On the other side are a group of economists that hold a rigid mechanical theory of the effect of the supply of money. These are the Keynesians. He even points out the velocity of circulation and says it would take too long to point out all the flaws in this rigid mechanical theory. At least for this book. So, if you want to hear a criticism of this book, you'd have to go elsewhere. Instead, he explains how inflation comes about and what the consequences are. This is basically a theme in Hazlitt's book here, that there was the problems and various proposals are so numerous that critiquing them is very, very difficult and time consuming. Meanwhile, if you understand the issue that they are talking about, it becomes very, very clear that they just don't understand what's going on. So let's go and try to explain what's going on when inflation occurs. So inflation needs to have a cause. So say the government runs a deficit and uses inflation to pay war contractors. The first effect is to increase the prices of supplies used in war and to put the newly minted cash into the hands of the war contractors and their employees. The war contractors and their employees will have higher incomes. They will spend this money, and the sellers of products will be able to rise prices because of the increased demand. This will continue in ever widening circles until the printed cash has moved throughout the entire economy. People will have more money, but the prices of goods will have risen correspondingly. The nation is no more richer than before. This is not to say that there will be no shift in wealth or income. The first groups to get the money will benefit the most. The last groups to get the money will be negatively impacted the most. The last groups will have to pay higher prices before they get the money. the newly minted money. It is a simple wealth transfer from some groups to others. It is another example of the lesson. It brings some short-term benefits to some group without taking into consideration the long-term effects on the whole community. Do you have anything to say about that email?
Not really. It's pretty much like a reiteration of from a different perspective of previous chapters of the book. From the
we've
broken
seen,
window and such.
Yeah, we've seen this ever-widening circle of impact from a various decision, government policy or broken window. So there is a more technical discussion of this in the chapter, but I just decided to summarize it.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not just repeating what the book says verbatim. So to continue, once the money is in the economy, it is impossible to stop the effect of inflation. You cannot stop it from passing on to ever-widening circles, nor can you keep the prices the same. The present valuation of money often relies upon what people expect the future quantity of money to be. This explains why This explains once superinflation sets in, that the valuation of money is decreased at a greater rate than is or can be increased. Yet the order of inflation never dies. It seems that one country cannot learn from the experiences of another.
Mm.
And I think this explanation of why superinflation is a thing is very enlightening.
And how so?
Because it would explain why essentially the effects of inflation can accelerate. It's not just the effects of inflation all of a sudden hitting a economy, but it's the fact that people, the valuation of money relies upon what people expect the future quantity of money to be. And so once people realize that inflation is going crazy, they'll value the money less and less and less.
And they'll ask for more policies to curb these effects that will benefit some people over others, and a whole bunch of different, things that will not solve it.
Yep. So I also see that the superinflation, as you might think that the way to solve the superinflation, like the lowering valuation of money, is just to print more money, because the valuation of money is being decreased at a greater rate than it is being increased. And so you might think, oh, we'll just print more money than at a faster rate. But then that's just feeding into the superinflation thing.
So you said that there's no way to reverse this, but is this the case for fiat money, or would getting rid of that potentially solve it, or would because all the inflation and pricing and everything was artificially altered in the first place, that it would just cause mass economic destruction anyway before things settled down and started organically just coming back to what it you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, so what I mean by it's impossible to stop is once you have introduced newly minted cash into an economy, you cannot stop it at, say, this circle of the economy. it's going to spread throughout the entire economy once it's inputted into it.
Okay.
And this is true of any system that can print money or that can increase money. So, for instance, even if in Kazakhstan, where all of the money is demand notes, Rothbard talks about this in the case against the Fed. So even if a bank starts printing false receipts for gold, then the same issues of inflation will occur.
Okay.
It's just that it's more easily seen as fraud when a private bank starts printing false receipts.
Okay. I was just curious to that.
Yep. So the most persistent argument for inflation in Hazlitt's day is that inflation will get the wheels of industry moving. We can see this in all day as well. You always need a bailout or to send $1,200 checks in the mail to keep the industry moving. What is missing from the common discourse today is the talk of full employment. Very rarely will you hear anyone speak of full employment. So
I actually recently saw an article from, I want to say it was NBC, but they were trying to promote the idea of mandatory labor or mandatory service, not necessarily like in the military, but like of just work. And that made me kind of nervous because they're whether it's going to happen or not, they're starting to pump that idea into the public.
yeah, and it's if you're looking at it from an economic perspective, one argument might be that you need to create work, but we've already talked about the issues with just creating work and make work policies and such. So
Right.
So it actually does work to get the wheels of industry moving, but not in the way that most proponents of inflation think. So the reason why it works is it will raise commodity prices in relation to wage rates and increase business profits. This will cause a resumption of output from idle resources. Thus, a resumption of output from idle sources will take place by restoring a workable relationship between prices and costs. It could be more directly and honestly be brought about by simply decreasing wage rates. Proponents of inflation believe this is politically impossible, but many also decry it as anti-labor. Here's some of my editorializing. Harding, when he was on the presidential trail, even remarked on this fact during the Depression of 1920. He's really the last president to understand economics, and he was a fairly good president until he died in 1923. Labor itself has become sophisticated with labor unions. For it is the big unions that have the most political power that are most likely to be in need of a correction in their labor rates. The unions, because of their political power, will insist on increases to their wage rates in accordance to the index. Thus, their labor rate correction will not happen.
Neither of us can speak today.
It's mostly because I'm trying to actually pronounce my R's instead of just skipping them like I have been doing.
Yeah,
And I
you
just,
got an accent. It's okay.
it's not an accent, it's actually a speech impediment.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not judging you for it.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
I
just,
sound pretty faggy myself, so I'm not gonna.
anyways. I'm just trying to get more used to actually pronouncing things.
You sound
Okay.
emo, so
By the
it's
way,
on
I'm not.
brand.
Huh?
You sound emo, so it's on brand.
Awesome. By the way, Colton, I'm not saying you sound faggy, because you don't.
Okay. The most sophisticated proponents of inflation are disingenuous. They deceive even themselves. They talk about money as the more naive inflationists do, then bring up a multiplier. This becomes the equivalent of millions of dollars added to wealth. They distract from the real causes of any existing depression, from maladjustments in the wage cost price structure. Inflation may correct them from time to time, but it is not an open and honest correction, but a illusionary correction. And actually, I think this is a very this kind of conclusion is very important to understand. And so, not only does he take a shot at labor unions, saying that they are mucking with the price cost wage structure, but he's saying that it is precisely because of their political power that such corrections can't happen. Then he also is talking about really maladjustments in the wage cost price structure is a part of the Austrian business cycle, and so understanding this part can help you understand that.
All right.
So inflation may. So, anyways, next paragraph. In order to pay debts, one must tax more heavily than the government spends, and thus destroy wealth in the nation. The only escape is to assume that governments will borrow during depressions or deflationary periods to fill any gaps and to swiftly pay it back when there would be a boom or an inflationary period. This is a beguiling fiction, and politicians have never acted this way. And even Keynesians or post-Keynesians, like Paul Krugman of the New York Times, does not call for paying back the debts when times are good. There was a episode on the Contra Krugman, there might be many episodes on the Contra Krugman podcast that actually went into this. And it's actually sad that the Contra Krugman podcast has gone away.
Oh, has it?
Yep. It ended like 2 weeks ago.
Oh, damn. I never got around to listening to it since I'm fairly new to Austrian economics. I guess I've got stuff to go back and listen to.
Yep. They're going to keep it up. They just want to spend time on new projects as they feel like they have said everything they need to say about Krugman. Which
Okay.
actually makes me wonder if they're going to keep the Contra Cruz around.
They'll probably contradict other people now. I don't know.
Yeah, I have no idea. So, deficit spending, once embarked upon, creates powerful interests which demand its continuance under all conditions. So, Yeah, it's not just the intelligentsia like Krugman that will demand it, but people want to keep up the same amount of government spending, and they're not going to tax. They can't tax really enough to get it, so they need to use inflation. As I believe Ron Paul said this past week, the reason why we must keep on bombing, other countries is because the military-industrial complex wants to sell bombs. And so it is the people that get the inflation that are the interests that demand its continuance, just as the military-industrial complex demand a continuation of our foreign policy. So inflation itself is a form of tax. It is not a tax on every individual's expenditures, but on his savings and life insurance. Inflation is a form of tax out of control of tax authorities. It may tax the poor more in percentage terms than the rich. Inflation discourages prudence and thrift. It plants the seeds of fascism and communism. It makes men demand totalitarian controls. And I think that's a really interesting note to end on, is that inflation itself. Let me get what he exactly says. It ends invariably in disillusion and collapse. And so, yeah, and it's kind of interesting how these injustices that inflation causes, essentially make people want remedies. And since they don't really understand economics, as the people paraded around as economists by the mainstream, are promoting inflation, they don't understand that it is inflation that is the cause of all their ills. And so they rather conflate it with capitalism or something else.
Yeah, and we've been seeing that for a while, but especially since the COVID-19 lockdowns and then the all the bailout money and welfare and everything, and now we're just seeing that amplified quite a lot.
Yep. So it's, I mean, the communist argument, the Marxist argument against, inflation and the money system and so on and so forth has been around a while, but you've seen more and more people adopt it. And
yeah,
that's the scary part.
Yeah, as you know, I've been reading a bunch of Mencius Moldbug stuff recently, and I find his conception of what's called the cathedral very blackpilling and actually really scary, because we always talk about like how decentralization is the way forward, but it seems like our enemies in the left and Marxism and postmodernism and such have already figured that out and have established lots of decentralized special interests that propagate these ideas. And that's why it's so hard to attack them, and why there seems to be a constant leftward shift.
Well, it's not just that they're decentralized, but they have used things like the FCC to reduce the amount of competition. For instance, in the 1930s, FDR's administration basically attacked small newspapers in order to get rid of competition, and it led to only a few newspapers from the 1930s until I believe it was the 1970s.
Could you repeat that? My earbud fell out.
Okay, so then the FDR administration actually attacked small newspapers so that way they could get, in order to reduce competition in the area, in order to have only a couple big corporations walk in that area. And so yeah, it's they actually know that if they allow decentralization to occur, to have competition in the marketplace of ideas of news, that they will be able to have actual dissent. And things were actually getting better in the 1980s and 1990s in terms of this. But then essentially cable news has started centralizing ever since the 1990s.
Mm.
And Moldbug is an interesting figure. I haven't read that much about him, but I've heard people talk about the cathedral, and I tend to agree that all these people all in cahoots together.
Right. Yeah. He says things like the inner party and the outer party, and you could say like the outer party is like the Republicans, and they will oppose the inner party, which is the Democrats and the progressive left and such. But it'll only be like so far as I guess it's hard to describe. They'll when they get into power, they will do the things, they'll do a few of the things that they said they were going to do, but in large part, we've seen them compromise in such a way to maintain their power rather than, be principled or anything. And this kind of shows that conservatism is progressivism driving the speed limit, whether they're even intentionally doing this or not. It would depend on the individual for sure, but the parties themselves exist basically to oppose each other on only certain things so that it basically balances them out and continues a further leftward drift.
Yep. It
I have
basically
something
controlled.
I think I should say. Actually, it's two things, but first one is just a
Basically
funny
controlled.
little comment, which is I like how every time we start talking, like we start going on a tangent in this podcast, we end up mentioning the coronavirus lockdown just because of like how worse it has made basically everything in terms
Yeah.
of economics and in terms of the government doing poor economic decisions. Because every time there's a crisis or something that's out of the ordinary, it's always the precedent that they need for all these stupid economic decisions. And with this big one that we have this year, it's been a shit show of poor economic decisions and things that are really going to impact the economy, not just right now, but also in the future. And the other thing that I
Yeah.
wanted to say was about what you mentioned about Modbug. I guess you could say I'm our little resident neo-reactionary here. So, for those who are watching, if you're unfamiliar with Moldbug's work, the concept of the cathedral explained in like 30 seconds is essentially like the U.S. government is not actually controlled by the head of state or our Congress or any politicians or any political parties. Instead, it receives direct order from what he calls the cathedral, which is essentially the influential and academic like layer of society. So it's basically the media and universities and companies. So it's basically the minds and the mouths of society, and they are the ones who dictate the government or what the government does, and the government never goes against them, or not against them directly. It may oppose them in a few things, but it's always going to end up going their way because of their influence. And what you were talking about with decentralization and how they already figured that out and how they already opposed that, that is absolutely true, and it's in fact probably a lot worse than what Modebug describes in his earlier works, because if you just look at it, and you can find great documents detailing all of this. You can find charts with the names of all these people and how exactly the system is organized. You guys know that I made something of that sort myself. But if you just look at all these companies, the media outlets, the Hollywood studios, the newspapers, etc., the TV channels, they are all controlled by the same few conglomerates, and they are all associates of a few international think tanks, namely the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, or the Bilderberg Group, which are the three biggest international think tanks probably. And so even if you don't believe that there is a cable running the U.S. government or running the world,
A cabal.
a cabal, just knowing that, and this is a fact, this isn't like a conspiracy, you can just go on Wikipedia and you're gonna find this. Just knowing that all these people, all of these companies are connected by a few organizations, and that they all have meetings, and that they all discuss, how they run their business and how they do things, that on its own should be scary enough to anyone who cares about decentralization, regardless of whether you believe they have an end game or not.
It's actually kind of interesting that you bring up that it's the think tanks controlling the government, because this is kind of what the opposite of what Rothbard brings up in Anatomy of the State, that the state will fund intelligentsia in order to justify its own positions.
Yeah, well,
so
I'll have to disagree with him there, and I think I have enough reason to do that. It's just that what you see is that the governments do what the think tanks say, and it's not just the think tanks justifying things that the government does. You have people, the people who are behind the think tanks, they are usually not associated with the government directly. They are usually behind financing politicians, financing other things, but they are not directly involved with the government. So what you have in reality is a select amount of people, a select amount of families, a select amount of corporate groups who are watching over their own interests, which at the moment require them to restrict economic freedom in order to maintain their monopolies. And they are doing that through think tanks, which will dictate what the government does. And the purpose of these think tanks is basically to make sure that all of the policies within the Overton window are policies that benefit them one way or the other. And and when you have this thing, conservatism is just progressivism on the speed limit, that's the reason, because they're making sure that all of the policies within the Overton window benefit them somehow. Maybe it will benefit them today, maybe it will benefit them in 10 years or 100 years, but their job is just to make sure that it stays that way, so that their interests stay in focus of the government. The government is just like the front desk of all of this. It just enforces it, and it's just their direct way of controlling property that they don't already own directly.
I can understand where you're coming from, but it is true that the government does hire an intelligentsia, which is the universities, which is the public school system, fall beyond what they would normally be
Yeah, but
paid
the thing is
on.
not you can't just say like and here's why I disagree with the government being on top of everything, which is what a lot of libertarians believe. The government is not, an absolute monarchy. It's not like it used to be. So the government is several hundred people, maybe several thousand, depending on how much you consider part of the government. And what I will agree with you that often the heads of state, the most important government figures, they are going to be complicit in this idea, in this plan for centralization, and that is because they are directly associated with the financial heads of those think tanks and those conglomerates. They are directly related, so it's not that the government is directly below the think tanks. They almost work in parallel. So one benefits the other while the other, enforces what the people on top want. And a lot of the people that are on the heads of the think tanks, they're directly related to the heads of the governments. So it's not like it matters exactly who's on top and who's, below, because they all work in parallel.
I would say that
trying to drive at is that it can't be all just the think tanks and
No, it's definitely not. The people in the governments are directly associated with these people, and I can give you examples of that. Just to name one, Winston Churchill was directly associated with the Rothschild family, which is, one of the biggest international banking families in the world, and they are associated with several of these think tanks that I mentioned. So, it's not that just one telling the other what to do. They are directly associated. They are personal friends.
I would say that Rothbard was still definitely right. The institution of a state allows for these entities to basically have a symbiotic relationship with one another. It's still like because they influence public opinion and policy as well as the opinions of those already in the state. I would say that. I just lost my train of thought.
I agree with that. I know where you're getting at, and the only thing that I disagree with most ANCAPs, with most libertarians, is that a lot of them just even if they understand this, they will just stop there. They will go, okay, so all of these organizations are bad, but the state is the only entity that allows them to exist and allows them to enforce these policies. And while that may be true on a surface level, what is also true is that these companies, these associations, these think tanks, etc., are also responsible for maintaining and expanding the state. So it's not just one way, it's both ways. And what a lot of them get wrong, in my opinion, is that they will stop at the government. So they'll just say, if we get rid of the government, everything is going to be fine. Things are going to go back and take their natural course, and the free market is going to take over and fix things, and these evil corporations are going to lose market share and eventually disappear and give place to better, honest corporations. And I don't think that's true, because even if you just snapped your fingers and the state disappeared, the society, the grasp that these organizations have on society, especially the media, the studios, the newspapers, etc., also the universities, the academics, the grasp that they have on society is just so tight at the moment that even if the state disappeared at a blink of an eye, all of these people that they've already brainwashed would still support them, would still support their policies. They would be able to just re-erect a new government, probably a more authoritarian than ever government, and it just wouldn't fix things. You have to get rid of both in my opinion. You have to get rid of the government, of the state as we know it, and you also have to get rid of all these people behind it, all of these people plotting against liberty and plotting against decentralization.
I have myself wondered, without reading Moldbug at all any way before, like if we were to have just somehow abolished the state, what would stop all these, mega corporations or whoever consists of the cathedral in, like, say, purchasing like tons of militias to, like, basically seize people's incomes and assets and
Yeah,
just
no.
like establish another
Have.
state.
They definitely have the power and the capital to do that. The state, the
Yeah.
government, is what they use is only what they use to control property that they don't directly own. So, say you have a house, and that house is your private property, but you pay property tax. And if you don't pay property tax, they're gonna eventually seize your assets. They're gonna eventually seize your house. So it's not like you actually own that. It's not your actual property. They're basically just leasing it to you, and that's what they do through the government. They're using the government to control property that they don't own directly. But if the government disappeared, well, the problem is a lot of people, not a lot of people, everyone is currently dependent in the government because they use the government's currency. And because they have the government's currency, that means that they often don't have a lot of actual wealth, a lot of actual capital under their name, because they exchange it for money, for the currency. And that's also a way of them controlling your property without directly owning it. And if the government disappeared and all of that disappeared, first of all, a lot of people would lose a lot of things because, they don't have it as actual capital. They don't have it as actual property. And the people who control the money, the people who control the currencies, and thus are part of the system, they do. And they would definitely use that to build up whatever they wanted and just, maintain themselves in power. They wouldn't just let that slide and just, let everything be fine simply because, the White House was demolished. So the takeaway, if there is one, is that both of these groups, I wouldn't say it's both because it's not two, there's a little bit more to it, but all of these groups, all of the heads, all of the limbs of the system must be destroyed utterly. Otherwise, they will just basically rebuild themselves.
This is honestly, like, if you were a libertarian before and you're just now hearing about stuff like that, it's a lot more dire sounding than it already was.
I will not lie. It's a huge black bill at first, and the way to counter that, the way to think more positively about that is, I'll just say this: there is a plot against liberty going on at the moment. You may say that it's a plot for one world government, or it's a plot against white people. It doesn't matter. There's clearly a plot against liberty, and you can describe it as several different things. The way you can look at more positively is that, okay, if we don't do anything, they will have it their way. We're not sure if we can win, but not trying is not really an option. We have to try to do something to stop this. So it's best for us to believe that we can do this. It's best for us to believe that we can beat this system, because otherwise, what's the point? So you just have to try to be positive about it, even though it's a huge black bill, because we need to be positive in order to have the mental strength to beat it.
That was actually pretty inspiring.
Yeah.
Hello.
For the people who are just hearing this and are...
Colton is I think Colton disappeared and came back.
Yeah. Okay.
You there, Colton?
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I was wondering if you could hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
So just for everyone who's like hearing this conversation now and feels like they parachuted into a battlefield they didn't expect to, there are several things you could read that will, give you more information on exactly what we're talking about. It's a little bit disconnected from libertarianism, as in it's not really political theory. It's just, I guess geopolitics you could call it. It's just, describing how things are, how things currently work in the world. It's not really proposing anything new or any solutions. It's just describing it. But if you go on my Twitter, you can find a very short, and by short I mean 2,000 words, document, which is a basic summary introduction to this concept, to these organizations that I mentioned, and to these types of things that I like to call the system, and which includes the government, includes several government institutions. My document, for instance, talks about the Federal Reserve and talks about the UN and talks about the European Union, etc. So it's not just private organizations. And you can just if you just go and look up these organizations on Wikipedia, you can find everything about who's behind them, what's the purpose that they were created for. And if you look into the people that were behind them, you can see what type of people they are. And I'll just say that it's not fancy.
Yeah, and Father Spiridon Bailey has actually written a book called Orthodoxy and the Kingdom of Satan, and some of the chapters are called War, the United Nations, Powerful Elites, the European Union, Freemasonry, Ecumenism, Zionism, Banking, One World Government, the Council on Foreign Relations, Christianity, the Real Enemy, and Preparing for What Is to Come. And so he has also talked about this, and he has a more sober interpretation of our times.
Yeah, if you ever just, I'm not gonna go on about this anymore because I think we've gotten the point across. But if you ever want more information about this, feel free to DM me on Twitter. I have open DMs on Twitter. I always read the requests. I don't always accept them if they are spam or something, but I always read the requests. So just DM me. I can point you towards tons of information regarding this subject. So yeah, just so we don't have to talk about it anymore. And we can,
I'm sorry I put us on a big tangent. It's just as I've started reading this stuff.
No, this is definitely.
I'm starting to see. And I'm like in the last week of really just reading like half of 2 books so far. I'm really seeing it like everywhere. Like it's crazy how this has just been in front of our faces for so long, and hardly anybody really sees it.
Yeah, no,
like
I think
when you
go on.
Well, when you've seen, you'll see people like talk about Illuminati conspiracy theories and other things, and you're just like, man, that's just some crazy conspiracy theory stuff. But when you actually have a sober, a very sober and then calmly explained explanation for what it really is, then you're just like, okay, I see what you're saying. And because all this information is so muddled
publicly
up,
available.
It's really hard to accept it. Yeah.
It's hard to accept it, but it's also hard to reject it.
Yeah.
If one more thing that I want to say, it's just interesting, I think. The biggest red pill, in my opinion, well, actually, the first big red pill is accepting that, the establishment is not actually our friend. And that's the one that we all took at the very beginning of our political journey. After that, I think that the biggest red pill is that they're not doing this for profit. They're not doing this, money. All of these companies are not putting pride flags in their Twitter accounts and black men in their TV commercials for money. None of this is being done for money. These people already have all the money in the world. They are doing this because they hate us and they want to destroy our civilization. And I think that is the biggest red pill. Once you accept that, every time you see a TV commercial, you're going to see that this was thoughtfully placed behind that, the creation of that, and you start seeing that everywhere. I've had this argument on Twitter, just understanding that things don't always happen for money. This is not just late stage capitalism as the left and third positionists like to describe it. We are not just going through an economic struggle. Actually, if you know me, you know that I consider the economic struggle secondary. I would prefer, an anti-establishment government, even if it had a worse economics. I think that our primary struggle is cultural and, by extent, ideological. But yeah, that's another large tangent that we don't really need to get into.
Yeah, we're coming up on 2 hours, or if we haven't already, we're just a couple of minutes over 2 hours.
Yeah, we're about to hit 2 hours right now, so yeah.
All right, so we were done with that last chapter, right?
Yeah, we ended it, which is why I allowed the discussion to go on so long, because if anyone was disinterested in what Kyle had to say, we were done. Anyways.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I just didn't have time to read the book. I was, my university semester just ended this week. So, it was like delivering projects left and right. And I just, I also work. So I really didn't have time to read, let alone make notes and stuff. But it was nice to, just sit here, help you guys with the stream and listen to you guys talk. Even if I didn't have much to add about the chapters themselves. But yeah, hopefully the next book that we do, which is going to be the anti-capitalist mentality, right? It's a really short book, and it's a book that I'm interested in reading because I haven't read any Mises, actually. So it's a book
we've also been told. Yeah, we've also been told it's a good introduction to Mises. So if anyone hasn't read Mises before,
I'm really interested in it because I was reading into him, not his work, but into him a little bit, and I was really interested by knowing that he was an economic advisor to Engelbert Dollfuss of Austria until he was killed by Nazi agents. And it makes me really curious about...
There was just threats that he would, so he left Austria and went to America.
Yeah, but he was killed by Nazi agents.
That is
and Mises narrowly evaded the Nazis.
Yeah, no, not
right
Mises.
After he
I'm
left.
talking about Dollfuss. Dollfuss was killed, not Mises. Just to clarify.
Yeah. I get what you're saying. Yeah, I got that part.
Yeah, but he was an economic advisor to Dollfuss, which was Chancellor of Austria from 1932 to 34 until he died, I believe. And it just makes me curious. He was a fascist, but he was, incredibly anti-Nazi, and it makes me curious about what course would Austria have taken if he remained in charge with Mises by his side, because in the little period that he stayed in power, he had already fixed hyperinflation and a few other major economic problems. So I can only imagine what would have happened if he stayed in charge.
Yeah. From what other people have said, like Tom Woods and other historians in the Austrian school, he wasn't actually paid too much attention to in Austria as an economic advisor. So it wasn't as amicable a relationship as it might at first seem.
I see.
Yeah, which is unfortunate,
Yeah.
but Mises chose to comply as much as he could with the fascist regime in Austria, and I mean, obviously it's not ideal, but whatever of Mises and the Austrian economic school was used, I mean, that's good for what it was worth.
Yeah, and I mean, we all know what happened afterwards, so we know that, it wouldn't take much for it to be better. Because, Austria was militarily annexed, militarily occupied, and then shortly after fell into war again, and, after that they were, independent again, they were economically weak, they were prohibited from military alliances, all that post-war jazz, and they could have avoided all of that, and with a decent government, they would be a lot better off today than they are.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And another really unfortunate thing is Mises escaped right before the Nazis got into his. I don't know if he had an apartment or
I think
whatever
it
he
was an
had.
office. He had an
Okay, yeah,
office, yeah.
they got yeah they pretty much just destroyed all his work. So who knows what he might have released had it not been destroyed.
Yeah.
Because I do know that he started a version of Human Action while he was still living there, but he completely like restarted it once he made it to America.
But yeah, I'm interested in
Yeah.
reading this book. Especially since it's really short, I really hope I can participate more on the next, the next book that we do here. And also, I think we're
Yeah.
gonna be joined by Triple H, so that's gonna be fun.
Yep.
Okay.
But next week we will be doing chapter 23 and 24, the last two chapters of the Economics in One Lesson. And then we'll also talk about conclusions, general themes of the book, and so on and so forth.
Right. Hopefully you've been learning stuff as we've been going through this economics in one lesson, Kyle, because I sure have for what I have been able to grasp of it.
Yeah,
I'm still gonna have to be rereading stuff.
I haven't read it. I read some of the chapters, especially in the beginning. A lot of what we talked about were things that I already knew because of other Austrian-related stuff that I had already read. A lot of the arguments are the same because a lot of the arguments are really simple. So there are a lot of things that I already knew, but there's definitely some really interesting insights. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we about done for the night? Is it time to chill?
Yeah, I guess so.
We can chill.
All right.
Always gotta chill. Gotta get that dopamine. But yeah, our Twitters are on the top right in yellow.
Yep. I'm Colton. I'm at Hetsu very much.
I'm Kyle. I'm at UFFT Kyle.
I'm Emo Hoppean. I'm at Emo Hoppean 346.
And
And yeah, that's it, I think.
yeah, I think we'll see you all next week.
Hang on one second because I think we have to shill the Mises Institute for being the primary a primary source of Austrian economics and the such.
Yep.
So you can find most. I think you can find most of the books that we're going to be going through on Mises.org for free audiobook. There's audiobooks, there's PDFs. You can buy physical copies from the Mises bookstore. This particular book we're going through, I believe, is on was it the Freedom for it's on fee. I forget what it actually stands for, but
Foundation for Economic Education.
Okay. Yeah, you can get Economics 1 lesson from there or from Amazon.
Yep.
And I can't think of anything else.
Yeah, I think that's it for today. This was actually a long episode.
Yeah, well, it's mostly because we spent at least half an hour not talking about the book.
Yeah, but it was definitely worth it, I think.
Yeah.
Yep. So,
Mario
anyways,
just said in the chat that it was a nice stream. It was fun to listen. Thank you.
yep.
Thank you, Mario.
Yeah, I feel like a little bit, especially the beginning was a little bit slow. It's just two people. It's just you two talking about the book. It's not like when we had Mac and I also, which was a little bit more energetic. But still, you guys did a good job on the two chapters, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, we've tried to get other people to join in, but it is a time commitment to read the book ahead of time. It's not just show up for the stream.
Yeah. All right, I guess that's it then.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. See everybody later.
Yeah, see you guys next week, or on Twitter.
Yep.
Yeah.
So.
All right. So